Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Demon Folklorist. I am, yes, that demon folklorist. Today we're going to be talking about Dybbukim, women, and psychics. Something to start off with is that Dybbukim interests me personally for two reasons. First, I absolutely love the movie The Unborn. It came out, I believe, in 2011 or 2000. It was like right around 2009 to 2011. I can't remember the exact year, but it is a yearly favorite. And also because I think that I might have been possessed by a Dybbuk or something really similar. So yeah, a bit of a personal interest for me. And this isn't the reason why Jews do this, but they do cover their mirrors when someone dies. And at some point in my oppression, I became very frightened of mirrors. Also, I had one pointed at my bed for several years, thinking nothing of it. And I definitely do warn people not to do that, to not even have a mirror anywhere in their room, because mirrors are known in the occult for being portals. In the Jewish tradition, they covered the mirrors because they need to focus on their own grief. It actually had nothing to do with Dybbukim. But I feared them for some reason, and it might be because my psychic awareness, even though I was in such a heightened state of stress, knew something was wrong there. Something was wrong with them. So another girl who had reached out to me who had a similar story to mine when my thesis was published, I asked her some questions, and there's some kind of link between having mirrors pointed at your bed, psychic ability, and then the kind of experience that me and her had. So, for a definition, a Dybbuk is a once human spirit that now wanders. They are barred from both heaven and Gehenna, which is sort of like hell, but it's more like a purgatory. It's usually about 12 months of purifying polluted souls. And Dybbukim, which is the plural version of Dybbuk, are actively pursued by angels. These beliefs implied that there was the existence of the soul after death, and it had Kabbalistic overtones from the time period. These types of possessions and exorcisms mostly existed in the 16th century, and this was from primarily poor, marginalized people. Possessing someone else for the Dybbuk let their soul escape its torment, and this would happen for a period of time if they found shelter in another person's body. But it's actually a big no-no in the spirit world to possess somebody because it corrupts their free will, and you have to assert your own free will over theirs, so that's not cool. An Ibor is different. It's actually the same thing as a Dybbuk intrusion, but the purpose is different. This is a good soul. An Ibor is a good soul that comes to impart wisdom, or they're there to help the person that they're possessing. And to me, I can only really equate it with Haitian voodoo and their voluntary spirit possessions, because it's said to be ecstatic when a voodoo saint is possessed. Now, Western audiences cannot imagine that it would ever be an ecstatic experience to be possessed in any manner. So in all of our movies, it's always a forever evil and terrifying ordeal, but to me, it's actually more of a focused form of channeling. And then Sheol is a very neutral sort of place for spirits. Everybody goes there regardless of whether you were good or bad in your life. And what it reminds me of is in the Odyssey, Odysseus calls up a prophet who has passed called Tiresias in the underworld. And Tiresias is not happy to be back in the world of the living at all. He's basically like, what do you want? And dude, just go away. Let me go back. So maybe in Sheol there is rest for spirits, but it's definitely not the same situation in Gehenna. It was also called Gehenna back in the old days. So also Shedim during this time were thought to be part human and sometimes part animal. It was the fate of evil humans. And I've always understood them as Jewish jinn. Then unfortunately, Shedim became the overarching word for demon. So really, it's hard to say exactly what they are. They could even be sort of like skinwalkers in that they were once human, but through dark magic or other twisting of their humanity, they're now animal. or part animal in the spirit world, because my family actually struggles with Shidam bothering us, and they often have wings, bird feet, all sorts of things, and this does come up in the folklore, so really interesting. But this emergence of a new type of possession can be traced back to shifts in demonology, magical practices, Kabbalistic anthropology, all that sort of thing. And it was centered around closing that door between the living and the dead. But it was also centered around popular ideas about ghosts and possession. So it all kind of melded together. And then if you think about this time period, there was a lot of interchange of ideas about witchcraft, magic, demons from nearby countries that filtered into Jewish folklore at the time. Dybbuk behavior, now, it could be animalistic. They might convulse, climb trees like cats, speak in a strange voice. They could display knowledge that that particular spirit has, but the living person who they're possessing does not. They were very violent about leaving the person's body. And the process of exorcism was getting them to confess their sins and leave through ritual, but they were very much human, so they could recite these intimate details of their lives. This alone makes me think that they aren't jinn, that ability to recite those intimate details, because we could say that a jinn would stalk you, but I'm going to be honest, I don't think they're that interested in watching us all the time. That's like a whole different thing. So no, I think this is probably a different sort of entity, and most likely they are that person, because I just don't think jinn are interested enough to like sit there and watch every single detail of your life and then commit it to memory. So most likely this was the person, simply because only that person would ever be that interested in that person's life. So that's my thinking anyway. The process also of taking over another person is often violent, and it yields very strange behavior, because if you think about it, it's a struggle for ultimate control over that person. The person's will is probably fighting back, and they're trying to fight this thing off. And this thing's trying to overpower the person whose body that is. And it's something to kind of keep in mind, I think, that no matter whether it is demonic possession, Dybbukim possession, jinn possession, it is always a violent struggle for control. Now, the way that Dybbukim apparently came into people's lives and into their bodies is it was thought through sin, or opening themselves in some way to sin, that they could come in. But naturally, that's really biased to the culture and to the time period. It was also said that if you were violating norms or man's law, but I've always said that demons don't come in through cracks, they come in through doorways. But maybe Dybbukim can kind of bypass that rule because they were once human. And maybe they just need the portal to do it. So, like I said, take the mirrors out of your room, especially psychic women. It seems to be prevalent among psychic women. I don't know why. But possession in general also seems to function much like demonic possession. And one thing that happens in some of these accounts is that people would talk, like this thing would talk through it wouldn't be even using their mouth. There would be a voice that's issuing from them, but that person's mouth wasn't moving. And you actually see that in demonic possessions. In my own experience, I don't think this is what happened, because my parents would have probably noticed if I was talking, but it was another voice. They did not actually pick up on the fact that I was possessed at the moment that they were talking to me. It was such a short conversation, and it's really hard to say what happened. If it's not a Dybbuk that possessed me, it feels like something really similar. And if I had to guess, I would say it was probably male. The exorcism ritual that people used to do back in the 16th century, when there was so much of these Dybbukim accounts, is that it functioned as a way for the soul to air their grievances with the local community, and it also functioned to reinforce the idea that you never actually escaped punishment, at least not in the spirit world, especially if you had actually escaped punishment in life, that there was no real escape. Exorcism was meant to return them to Sheol, or that world underneath the world of the dead where spirits were deep in the earth, and they would gather there, and everybody went there apparently. I don't understand. I have Jewish ancestry, but we're not practicing Jews. So I don't really understand the way that Gehenna and Sheol work. But, I'm doing the best I can here. It was also believed that those who had been killed that were reincarnated in pure newborns, and that those who were in Gehenna actually were reincarnated in bodies of those possessed by Dybbuks. So there really was no escape. And apparently reincarnation was something that people actively believed in. Dybbukim were considered very unclean and unholy. And this is because Jews, I don't know how Jews view things now. Like I said, I'm not a practicing Jew, but it was thought that death was very unclean. So I don't know if Jews today still believe that, but at the time period, they definitely did. At least in one instance, it's talked about how Dybbukim entered and left through the vagina, because this was mainly women that this was happening to. And Dybbukim as a concept raises questions like, could evil be born into the world this way, possessing a person? And the answer seemingly is yes. Like, what about through a baby? Judaism says no, that being reincarnated in a baby was reserved for only pure souls. And Dybbukim possessions are spoken about as a forced penetration or rape. And it had this like sort of strange pregnancy. According to Rachel Elior, Dybbukim were more of a social construct during a specific time period when women were unheard. And the Dybbuk possession could allow them to break marriages they didn't want to go through with, or to simply be heard in a public forum, since that's how these spirits were exorcised. They would go before the entire village or entire whatever, like, area, and all these people would gather, and it would air its grievances and confess its sins, and then it would be forced out. Again, women were often the ones being penetrated by this Dybbuk, so they would almost always have male voices emit from their throats. And it's thought that because women at this time were subservient to a patriarchal system that chose their lives for them, usually through marriages being arranged or coerced, through the Dybbuk, the women could shriek their inner feelings about everything they were feeling in a societally accepted way. Becoming ill was the way to escape their bonds, at least through the Dybbuk. So that's what a lot of researchers believe was going on. Not everybody, because there are accounts from before this time period, and then there were a few after as well. I'm not sure really what I think. I think it might have been a little bit of both. There is the possibility that once human spirits are forced to wander, especially if you think about ghosts and why they're here, some of them seemingly don't know they're dead. Some of them are in time loops. Some of them simply just don't want to move on. So they resist moving on to whatever the next phase is. Maybe they're afraid of judgment. Who knows, right? But they don't want to leave. Or maybe some of them are being punished. They seem to want to be alive again, is what I've noticed anyway. I'm not an expert on ghosts, so that's just the things that I've noticed. And I do want to add, though, that men actually did have Dybbukim intrusions, but they were much rarer. But when you think about the men who were saying this, they were often marginalized people as well. Now, we do have a little bit of Dybbukim media. So, like I said, I happen to love The Unborn, even though it's inaccurate as hell in a couple parts. I mean, especially in the presentation of this spirit. These were dark human spirits, and though they can act animalistic, they aren't like dogs with their heads upside down. The head upside down is actually a really fun idea, and I love that they used it. I remember that really freaked audiences out at the time. It's hard to say even what they look like. We just sort of know what would happen afterward. So The Unborn is about a girl who finds out that she had a twin in the womb, and she keeps having weird dreams about this kid, and it keeps saying things like Jumby wants to be born now. She finds out that the twin in her womb that died before they were born was named Jumby, right? And she's being sort of haunted by this brother that she never knew, except she finds out her heritage. Her mother had died by suicide, and before her suicide, she'd found out who her birth mother was, a woman named Sophie who was a survivor of Auschwitz. In Auschwitz, as a lot of people know, Joseph Mengele, who was a fucking monster, was doing a lot of experiments, especially on twins, pregnant women, a lot of occult-based things, and just really twisted versions of what science is. He was doing a lot of that, and twins were one of his primary focuses. And in this story, Sophie and her brother Barto were experimented on because they were twins. And Barto died from the experiments, but his body, I guess, like a Dybbuk came and he was brought back to life. Sophie ended up killing him because she knew that wasn't her brother. Barto has come back and is hunting their bloodline, essentially. So it's a very interesting look at the way that sort of ancestral hauntings happen and generational trauma and all that sort of thing. But, is it accurate? No, it's not. The Book of Mirrors, the Sephahammerot. I love the idea. And of course, there comes the mirror again. And she was told to break the mirrors because it could come through that way. And it's super odd that it's like that because that's what happened to me. Yeah, very interesting, but primarily inaccurate, except when they're explaining what a Dybbuk is. But also, no, Dybbukim don't have a connection to twins, and actually neither do demons. I have heard of somebody asking this question before, and there's no evidence or case to ever suggest that demons have a specific tie to twins. People really do watch these movies and come to people who work in demonology and are asking these questions, and we're like, where the hell did you get that? Because that sounds so made up. And it's like, then we find the movie that they got it from, and we're like, oh my God, what? Don't look to the movies, guys. The movies are completely inaccurate because it's trying to push the filmmaker's vision of this terrifying ordeal. I feel like they invent a lot for movies when, to me, demons are actually scarier than what they're showing you. Something that is an interesting idea, though, from The Unborn is this idea that possession is working one's way up in life forms like bugs and babies and children and up and up and up until you get to the true difficulty, which is grown adults. It would actually make sense to me that a spirit might start on lower life forms who have a lot less control of themselves, though in real life this would probably take too much time. And normally threatening spirits in narratives tend to work on a single person and they focus entirely on them. It would probably be too much energy to work one's way up. And entities don't seem to have much interest in lower life forms. It's not to say that children never can be possessed. They can. But I don't think it's something that happens super often because there's not much of a challenge. Children are still forming and still growing up and growing into themselves. So I'm not really sure of the reason, but that's my guess, that it's just not a challenge. You see that with demons too. Like normally when they attack children or possess children, it's to scare the adults, to scare their parent. Because what's more terrifying to a parent than the idea that you cannot help your child when something's attacking them? And then another movie, it's like quasi-related. Everything in my mind is sort of like a tree, way too many branches. So this to me is related, but there was this movie called Six Souls. It came out, I want to say, I don't even know when it came out. I really don't. But when I first saw it online, it was called Shelter. And I think that's what it was called overseas, but here it was renamed Six Souls. And this concept of shelter for the faithless comes up in this movie. And I think I saw it when I was around 18, so it's probably 2011, 2012. And it actually really freaked me out, right? I still hadn't had my possession experience that had happened at 19. And I was also super Christian, just very frightened of the occult and just not myself yet. I'd get freaked out by supernatural horror movies. Nowadays, that's just unheard of. Like, movies don't really freak me out, and I fucking love horror movies, as I'm sure you've noticed by the many, many horror movie episodes on here. But I was still able to be scared by these things. After my possession, nothing was as scary as what I had experienced. So, like, I don't know what that says about me, but it says something. Anyway, so the concept of shelter in this movie, there was this reverend back in the 1900s or so. He was preaching like faith revival, and he came to Appalachia, and he was talking to the mountain folk about this. And a lot of them left their primary belief systems with the Granny Witch and Appalachian witchcraft and turned to this faith for all their answers. And this did piss off the granny witch, but I think what really did it for her, that made her go, okay, I've had enough of this shit, is that this guy was preaching, I think it was like smallpox was going around and it killed many, many people. And he said that through faith, you could be healed. And unfortunately, he was not even believing of the faith that he was promoting, because he had his children inoculated against it to make sure that they didn't get the virus. And he was using them as, look, my children are so healthy. And yes, they've been exposed to whatever it was. It may not have been smallpox, but it was something like that. Something that was very virulent, and it was killing people. He was like, here are my children. Look at them. They're so healthy, but they had been inoculated. Once the granny witch found that out, her and her people, like, I think they killed the kids, which does put them in villain territory. They sucked out his soul. They filled his gullet with dirt to make sure his soul could not get back in. And then they performed some kind of ritual on him that made sure he would become a vessel for the faithless. And 100 years later, he's still doing it. And he comes into contact with a psychologist who is a woman of faith, but a doctor of science. So she doesn't really believe in multiple personality disorder, because she's consistently sort of debunking it with like horrific crimes when people plead insanity. So when she comes across this case, which seems like it is one man who seems to have several different personalities, and it's to the point where like one of them's in a wheelchair, and when that personality is called through, he falls over to the ground because he can't walk. Or one of them's left-handed, another one's right-handed, like all that sort of thing. And then as she looks deeper into these cases, what she thinks is happening is that he's mimicking things that he may have read about as a child to escape his traumatic life. That's what she's trying to prove. Except over time, she begins to find out that nope, actually, he is those people. She even brings in one of the mothers of, I think his name is David in it. And he was tortured in the woods, supposedly, by those Appalachian folk witches. But really probably what happened is that this guy, the vessel, who is the reverend and is still alive, found him in the woods when he lost his faith and sucked his soul out, and he was found dead. Because that's what happens. This guy comes and sucks people's souls out, and his body is the vessel where these souls sort of rest and find shelter, I guess, until they find their faith again. But yeah, like it kind of reminds me of that Dybbukim find shelter in other humans, but it's not because they've been made to be a shelter. It's because they were, in some way through sin or whatever actually calls that sort of thing. Because I really didn't do anything that would have warranted that, but I was broken down over time and oppressed, and something got in when I was put to sleep forcibly by medicine. So another movie that also comes to mind, they actually call it, like, they don't really even call it anything, but what is happening in the 1999 movie Stigmata is actually an Eber, or an Ebur. I don't know how to say it, but either way, it's spelled Ibbur. Remember, that is the soul of a good person who's trying to impart wisdom or help the person. So this was actually an Ebur, but it looked a hell of a lot like a demon. We have this young woman who doesn't really believe in God. She becomes, for some reason, the chosen vessel to bring the real testimony of Jesus Christ, which has been lost to our evil world, where women are promiscuous and we dress the way we want and blah, blah, blah. Like, really, a lot of movies from this time period are like, is the world ending because women are sluts? And it's like, no. It wasn't ending then. It's not ending now. Y'all can chill. Also, I don't think the eclipse is going to do anything, so y'all are probably fine. But it's really funny how movies of this time period were like, what's happening in Christianity? What are the witches doing? Is this the end? And it's like, no, it's really not. I've lived through two end times, 1999 and the advent of 2000. Oh, that was an interesting time. And then 2006. where 6606 happened, it was a very boring day. Literally nothing happened. So nobody probably knows when the world's going to end or if it's going to end. We don't know. What I found funny about this movie is that this is very clearly like an Ybor, but it's not presented that way. It is very much presented like this is a demon possessing her. And even the moment where she's totally possessed and she's writing out this testimony, like she looks like shit. I don't know. It never really described how Dybbukim like look when they are possessing somebody, but a good soul possessing someone probably does not look the way a demonic one would. You probably don't gain special powers. It's just, it was kind of weird how this movie didn't even seem to see that it had these really specific biases against what it was trying to say versus what we were seeing on screen, I guess. So I happen to love Stigmata because it's such an interesting movie. But I also have a penchant for bad movies. So if you watch it and you're like, what the fuck was that, Victoria? Well, I don't know. I like different movies for different reasons. Also, something I want to add is that you can sometimes gain the abilities of the spirit. Like with an Ybor, a woman actually did become clairvoyant after becoming possessed. But with Dybbukim, it's not to the benefit of the person at all. They just act insane, or they do evil, or they just want to talk. Really, in that case, the Dybbukim is just trying to find shelter. They're not there to help you. So because of the prevalence of this story, I do have to talk about the Dybbuk box. The Dybbuk box is not real, folks. It is a hoax, and it was a purposefully faked legend. Not true at all. The guy who made it up actually admitted it, but the unfortunate side effect of that story is that it was such a good story that people believed it anyway. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, the Dybbuk box was something that happened, I want to say early 2010s. I actually don't know the year. I just remember hearing about it. It was this story that a guy who had bought a random wine cabinet that a spirit was attached to it, and it was bothering them because they had it in the house, and once they sold it, it went away. And eventually they began to call it the Dybbuk box, and this story got worse and worse and worse because of anti-Semitism and how much of a big problem it is in the world continually. Stories like the Dybbuk box make that anti-Semitism worse because it gives people a Jewish boogeyman to fear. And stories started to go off on tangents like that the Dybbuk box was the reason the Holocaust even happened. And when it was taken out of Europe, that's why the Holocaust ended. And it's like, I'm sorry, what? Something that I do really want to stress is that people, they can be very evil. And blaming spirits for every single evil in the world, it solves nothing and it's not helping anything. And then something else that keeps coming up is how prevalent this was among women. And also that psychic ability comes up too. Sometimes the woman had psychic ability before the possession and sometimes during from the spirit itself. And I think personally that psychic ability, if one doesn't know how to protect themselves, it leaves them more open and vulnerable to spiritual attack. Often women who were possessed and seemingly ones who had psychic ability, as seen in the influence of women mystics in 16th century Safed, sure, it could be that it was like women who wanted to preach and be equal to men, but they were being listened to. So I doubt they would have gotten any kind of a following if they weren't somehow proving their predictions and their visions. Sometimes you were sort of like demonized as a witch, and other times you became a spiritual leader. It just really depended. But I do think that some of these predictions at least had to be on the money. Otherwise, eventually that sway that they have over people would have faded, and we see that actually in the Salem witch trials. In the beginning, these girls had all the power, and it just got to a point and a frenzy where they were accusing people that it would be ridiculous for them to be witches, and that's when people stopped listening. And then the witch craze died down, and these girls had no more power. There was even an instance where the same girls pretended to be possessed in front of this old woman. And this woman was like, get the fuck up. What is wrong with you? Like, idiots. No one believes them. But it's because these girls could not prove any of that. So that's my logic as to why these women mystics had this much power. And another really interesting thing is that Christian demonology and Jewish demonology had a very clear relationship, at least by the time of Manasseh ben Israel, who was a Jewish scholar. And from his works and other works of that specific time period around the 16th century, it might have even been 17th century. I'm not so good with dates. But the real problem was that by this point, it wasn't witches or demons that was the problem for the church, but disbelief in those things and on the living on after the death of the body with the soul. So really, all witch hunters were trying to prove the existence of such things because it proved the existence of God. Manasseh believed heavily that all magic was demonic, that witches had sold their souls to the devil who copulated with them and other demons, and they danced in his name. So we've got some very, very European ideas of what demons and Satan and witches were up to, which we know are overblown fears of what Christian clergymen feared was happening versus what actually was, which was mainly cunning folk and healers, people with psychic ability, divination. They were primarily trying to help along their own lives and cure their own ailments with these people. Most witchery in general is just people trying to fix their day-to-day life via magical means. It's really not the work of the devil. But I'll be doing a witch folklore episode later this year. Now, it's hard to say if Dybbukim are something that is still fully believed in. It sort of seems like it was just very trendy around 16th century, but it died out. There isn't a lot of information on them nowadays. When women had more of a role and a voice in society is when it died out. And like I said, when we saw with the Salem witch trials that oppressed young women, and which was many of the women who were being possessed by Dybbuks because they were being coerced into marriage, they will use the supernatural as a way to speak and be heard. So that is an important thing to note, I think, in why these stories proliferated the way that they did. But that's not to say that they weren't real. So it's difficult to say. I really don't know. Maybe it really was in this area a ton of women who just didn't want to be in these marriages and didn't want to do what they were supposed to do, and the patriarchy and all that stuff. It's hard to say whether they were real or not, or real in every single case. But like I said, my possession has more comparisons with Dybbukim than any other type of entity that I've ever come across. If you have a story like mine, yeah, definitely let me know. Like, the full version of what happened to me is in my book, The Black Hours, Modern Demonic Experiences and Folklore, if you're interested. It's available on Amazon, and you can read it and tell me if you think something like that happened to you, because I am very interested in that. Of course, I would like to know what happened to me. And the more information I can get on this, the better of a conclusion I can come to about what happened to me. Sadly, there isn't very much information on Dybbukim as I would like, and it's mostly accounts from the 16th century and almost no accounts from the modern day. Now, this could be because there's a misidentification of phenomena that maybe Dybbukim are very alive and well. We just have been calling it something else, which we've seen does happen a lot, but I don't have enough information for a book. I've only ever talked to one person where I think it might have been a Dybbuk, which to me is simply the soul of a dead person that's forced to wander and unable to go to heaven or hell, that possesses people to find shelter. That's what I'm referring to when I use the word Dybbuk. All the other things that are described could also apply, but it's hard to say what modern Dybbukim are doing versus what they were doing in the 16th century. Next, I'm going to be examining the demons that we see in media like Pazuzu and Payman and all those guys, and what their counterparts are in demonology versus what the media is saying that they do. I actually think, sneak peek of that episode is that I think a lot of what we call demons are actually jinn. And if you've read my book, you know that, because there was a problem with classification in ancient Judaism where everything became a shedim, and which was their word for demon if it was not of God. So that lumped a lot of stuff together. So yeah, tune in for that next month. And if you're wondering why my voice sounds an octave lower, it is because I was very sick recently. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. Hope everything's good with you. And I hope you have a Dybbuk-free day.